Welcome back, fight fans, to another episode of Career Profiles, and we're so glad to be back for another one after what was a marathon of a career profile of Jack Johnston. And sticking with these old-time fighters, we've got an absolutely brilliant fighter for this one for you. This is the story of Barney Ross. Now, for many people, you might not know who Barney Ross is, but for the historians that maybe listen to the podcast, you're going to know exactly who Barney Ross is, and we're going to go through his life and times inside and outside of the ring. And before we get into it, and before I let you come in, Johnston, on the episode, I just want to say, this is going to be a pretty difficult one for us because sometimes we do get tongue-tied with some of the pronunciations, and this one's going to be no different. There are some pronunciations from his Jewish heritage that I've struggled to try and get right, even in preparation for this episode, and if I can't get them right, bloody hell, Johnston, I don't know how you're going to get on.
Mate, I'd say, look, apologies if you are of Jewish descent, and we do absolutely destroy a certain name that you all know very well. It just flow off of your tongue. Unfortunately, it's not as easy for me and Sean, especially for me. I do try my best. I've tried recently, so yeah, do apologise if anyone gets offended. I'm sure you won't. But this is a fantastic story. Look, this career profile is just so compelling. We've got a guy in Barney Ross who was raised in the Chicago ghetto. He had to cope with the loss of a parent at a very young age, has connections to a certain famous gangster, goes on to become a world champion during the Great Depression, fights in World War II, is friends with Lee Harvey Oswald's killer, ends up hooked on drugs, and is an absolute Jewish boxing treasure. What an absolute tale we've got for you tonight.
Now, starting as always at the beginning and going way back before Barney Ross was born, and we're going to refer back to his father first and foremost, who was named Reb Itchik. Now, he left his son and his wife in Russia to look for work in New York. He arrived in the Jewish ghetto located on the Lower East Side in November of 1903, where he changed his name now to Isidore. Now, he got a job selling vegetables, butter and eggs from a pushcart before getting promoted to a horse and wagon, working all hours under the sun, sometimes 100 hours a week. Now, Barney himself later said that it took him 2 years, his dad, to save enough money to bring over his Polish wife and his 9-year-old son from Russia, where they settled in a small basement apartment on Rivington Street. Now, Reb and his wife, Sarah Epstein Razovsky, they worked on the grocery wagon together, but their vision of a better life was not what it was cracked up to be. The family never lived far from the breadline. From starvation and from illness, it was never far from reality. In fact, the couple unfortunately lost 2 infant children to either disease or starvation, as what we've been able to source. Now, they did have a second son, Maury, and then a third son, who arrived on December the 23rd, 1909. Now, he was named Dovber, which is also a meaning of bear, and that was in Ashkenazic and in Hebrew and in Yiddish. Now, his school recorded him as Barnett David Razovsky. His United States Marine Corps discharge papers actually have it, Barney David Ross. But among family and close friends, he was generally known as Beryl or Bitchik, which are all variants of another name known as Little Bear.
We're going to call him Barney here, because we know him as Barney Ross, not Beryl, not Birchik. We're going to call him Barney pretty much throughout of it. Barney Ross, you know, so you know who we're talking about. So 2 years after Barney was born, the family decided to actually relocate from New York to a 2-bed apartment on the 2nd floor in 1310 Jefferson Street, Chicago. The main reason for the move was because they had brought a grocery store directly opposite the store from Sarah's uncle, Sam Rosenberg, which was located on 1307 South Jefferson, also known as Maxwell Street Ghetto. So they've moved to Chicago because they've now bought this grocery store and they live opposite it. That's basically the setup. So it wasn't long before they had 3 more children a daughter called Ida, and 2 boys called Sam and George. Now, by the time the family were old enough, they were all given jobs in the family store to cope on their mainly busiest day, which tended to be a Sunday. Now, Barney and Maury would lift the heavy sacks. Ida would rake the customers' orders, while Sammy and George would sell cherry phosphates on the pavement outside for 2 cents each. Now, Reb followed strict Jewish tradition and made sure his family attended the synagogue as often as possible. And Barney, well, he was an excellent Hebrew student. He mastered the Jewish ways. His teacher was a guy called Stain, who the children actually called Hinky Dink. For some reason, that's their nickname for him. And Sarah often marveled at his teachings of her kids. She would say he could teach the Haftarah to a stone.
Now, the family worked hard and kept themselves out of trouble in a tough neighbourhood that was so notorious for its criminal activity, so much so that the police and crime reporters named the neighbourhood Bloody Maxwell, or the Bloody 20th. Now, the Chicago Tribune claimed in 1906, murderers, robbers and thieves of the worst kind are born, reared and grow to maturity in numbers that far exceed the record of any similar district on the face of the globe. Now, this was an area well known for bringing up Jewish mobsters. Jacob Greasy Thumb Guzik, the financial genius of Al Capone's organisation, is probably the most widely known Jewish racketeer to have come from Maxwell Street. But Samuel Nails Morton, who owned a garage near the family grocery, made an impression on young Barney, and he recalled, Nails was known to be involved in the rackets, so Pa had always forbidden me to have anything to do with him. Pa wouldn't even sell him anything when he came into the store. Now, according to crime expert J. Robert Nash, Morton also took it upon himself to defend the streets of the Jewish community against invading gangs of other nationalities. Since the area was neglected by the police, Morton would patrol the streets at night with friends, carrying a baseball bat, and woe to anyone who thought to break into the shop of a fellow Jew.
Now, although his family tried their best to keep themselves out of trouble, and they tried to teach their children to be good Jewish kids, good Jewish people, but it was inevitable that the pull of this organised crime that was in and around the streets would be too much to ignore. And so Barney, well, he began a secret life at a very young age. He was gambling and doing petty crime. Now, he played craps on the corner, he stole fruit from push carts, and was involved in numerous fights with other kids on all around the block. Now, his rival gangs were the Irish, the Polish, and the Italians. It's pretty obvious, you know, thinking of New York, Chicago, same sort of thing, Irish, Jewish, Italian. Back in these days, they, you know, that was the main immigrants of those areas. And just to the north of the West Taylor Street, there was an infamous Italian-American gang called the 42s. Now, Barney would return home from the street with cuts and bruises. His father, Reb, would always be waiting to straighten out his son and inflict more damage with a leather whip. Now, Barney told sports writers, or a sports writer, Dan Daniel, years later, so this is Barney's own words here, he said, I got more beatings at home than I got on the streets. My parents had the typical Jewish attitude towards fights, black eyes, bloody noses, and, you know, the occasional skull fracture. Mum didn't like to see me come in late for meat and potatoes with bleeding scratches. So I got it good, and I kept right on battling those Italian kids and a lot of the Jewish ones too. Now, although small in frame, and another nickname, which was due to his size, was Runt. That's what his crew called him. Due to being obviously malnourished, they were on the breadline, as you said, Sean, and they found that he could scrap just as good as the rest of them. And he recalled, I was so fast on my feet, so agile, that I was able to get in a few quick punches, then dance and weave so much that my opponent would knock himself out trying to hang one on me.
Well, that's one way to do it, isn't it, when you're small in stature? Now, on December the 13th, 1923, the then 14-year-old Barney was getting ready for school when he heard a gunshot on Jefferson Street. He rushed downstairs, pushed his way through a small crowd, and saw his father laying on the floor with a gunshot wound to the chest. Now Barney tried his hardest to help stop the bleeding when his dad said, "It's all right, Beryl." Now ambulance attendants arrived and took him to hospital. The shooting made the afternoon edition of the Chicago Daily News, and this is what it said. Grocer, 60, shot in fight with robbers. 2 black men entered the grocery of Isaac Rozovsky, 60 years old, on Jefferson Street this morning and purchased 5 cents worth of apples. The grocer handed the apples to the men, and they drew pistols and ordered Rozovsky to stick 'em up. The grocer refused to obey and made for the men. He fell in his tracks with a bullet in his chest. Rozovsky's family heard the shot and came out just in time to see the robbers flee south in Jefferson Street. Now Barney visited his father in hospital and later remembered he awoke once to put a hand on a rheumatic shoulder which had bothered him for years, and he whispered, "It doesn't hurt anymore." He rubbed his beard and muttered, "Shema Yizori, hear, O Israel," before dying the next day. Now, of course, the family were completely devastated. Barney's memory of the funeral was his mother, who was so overcome with grief that she tried to throw herself into her husband's open grave. She was later hospitalised with a nervous breakdown, saying she could no longer bear to live in the apartment across the street from the murder scene. That's a shocking tale, and I feel very, very sorry for Barney Ross at this stage of his life, having a dad who was so proud, and maybe some people will say he was a little bit silly for doing what he did and trying to basically take these guys on, and they've shot him, and essentially he's died as a result of his injuries sustained in that incident, and poor Barney and his family were left to deal with the pieces that had been put all over the show. It's a real shame. It's a real shame to hear that, and it's not something I knew about Barney Ross's career and his life.
No, how awful. I mean, you lose your dad and then your mum has a nervous breakdown and she's just a mess. She can't live in the apartment anymore. You've just basically in one, 2-second thing, all of a sudden, these kids' lives have just been carved up into pieces. And the death of Barney's father had such a huge impact on the family that they all split up. His oldest brother, Ben, sold the store, and he used the money to send his mother to live in Colchester, Connecticut, where Reb's sister and elderly mother lived. So obviously leaving her children. Ben didn't have enough room to take in Barney and Maury, with his young wife pregnant at the time. So he sent them to live with their father's cousin, who was Henry Rassoff. And the 3 youngest children, well, they were taken to an orphanage. Barney later remembered standing in front of that grey, dingy-looking orphan. In his own words, he says that, with his fist clenched hard, vowing to make enough money to get them out of there. It's such a sad... This poor boy, 14 years old, and his whole life has just completely collapsed. Barney was now filled with so much anger that he admitted to being a lost soul, and later recalled in his autobiography, "No Man Stands Alone." It's a great book, by the way. I haven't read it all. We didn't use it as the main source. We'll tell you the main source at the end, but it's a great book. And he said in this book, his autobiography, "The bitterness and hatred inside me made me a much tougher fighter. Every opponent in the street fight seemed to remind me of my pa's murderers. And so I seemed to find extra strength in fighting them or kicking them in the groin and making them scream in agony." He had now completely gone off the rails, and he began to drink and smoke, and he wouldn't listen to anyone. And he was basically heading into a world of crime in a very, for a young boy at that age, teenage, coming into your teenage years, with some guys about, they can influence you quite easily. And he said, "In my terrible bitterness and hurt, I wanted to take my feelings out on something, and religion seemed to be the most logical thing to hit at. Religion had been the biggest thing in Pa's life, and what had it gotten him? The only Jewish custom I continued to follow was to say the Kaddish 3 times a day. But as far as I was concerned, I wasn't doing this for the sake of religion, but merely to pay my respect to Pa, and to prevent his remains from turning to dust, which according to ancient beliefs was what happened if he wasn't mourned."
Now, with no direction, young Barney left school and began working a variety of different jobs. But organised crime was where the money was, and he was now a regular at the Four Juices Cafe, a saloon, gambling den and brothel run by a gentleman named Big Jim, and also where a young Al Capone had graduated from bartender to bouncer to manager. Now, in that book, No Man Stands Alone, Barney said that he worked briefly for the Capone mob during the Prohibition years as a teenage message boy, and he said, Al's knowledge of the things that went on in Chicago was uncanny. He remembered who I was, and he knew all of the details of Pa's murder. The goddamn punks who killed him ought to be thrown in a river full of sharks, Al said. I was later to find that out, though, that Al Capone was the most ruthless man in the world when it came to fighting people who got in his way. He could be very kind and generous to people he liked. Now, Barney claimed that after a brief spell doing odd jobs for the boss, like fetching cigars and taking shoes to the bootblack and hand-delivering messages to other gangsters, Capone eventually decided to jog Barney on with a $20 bill and a warning to buy your family something and go back to school or get a job. Now beat it before I get mad. Many sports writers and historians have actually questioned Barney's relationship with Capone, and some indicate that there was more to the story. Like the New York Times, for example, who wrote this years later, and they said, there are many competing versions of the story of the connection between Ross and Capone, depending upon which Chicago greybeard you listen to. One has it that Capone, a benefactor of all things boxing in Chicago in the 20s, actually underwrote Ross's professional beginnings, and another that if it wasn't Capone himself, then it was one of his henchmen who gave Ross his amateur start. Now, whether you want to believe the closer connection, there was one thing that was for certain. Barney was associated with certain individuals closely tied to the Chicago rackets. Jacob Sparky Rubenstein, aka Jack Ruby, would become a close friend of Barney's. And this is the same Jack Ruby that was charged with the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. Now, it would seem that they became friends while on the streets fighting, and he would go on to later own a Dallas nightclub. Jack idolised Barney. He carried his water bottle at the gym and sparred with him frequently. Barney never abandoned his childhood friend, even when Ruby was on trial for first-degree murder.
That's just unreal. There's some stuff I never knew about before till we started doing this. So Barney was 15 when he first walked into a professional boxing club owned by Kid Howard, a former boxer who ran a small gym located on the second floor over a barber shop on the near south side of Chicago. He had become fascinated with boxing during his lunch breaks after seeing another street kid, Jacob Finkelstein, aka Jackie Fields, begin his rise through the ranks. Now, Fields would go on to win a gold medal in the 1924 Olympic Games in Paris and later become the welterweight champion of the world. Now, during one of Barney's lunch breaks, he finally plucked up the courage after witnessing what he'd seen and asked Howard to spar. And his response was, "You're too scrawny a kid to be a fighter." Barney persisted until a middleweight called Dave Shade stuck a cigar in his mouth and dared him to try and knock it out. The prize would be an amateur bout. Barney swung wildly like he had done on the streets, but Shade evaded all of his attempts before the gym just burst into laughter. Barney left the gym, obviously gutted. The next day, though, he returned. You know, as these kids always do, all these career profiles, they always come back. He returned on his lunch break again, and he asked for another go. This time, he managed to whack the cigar into Shade's lip. As promised, he was awarded a 3-round amateur bout. Although not a natural, he was eager to learn, and he later wrote in the Fundamentals of Boxing, "I took up the game and trained faithfully. It wasn't long before I could feel my chest expanding, my hands hardening and my body toughening, and my mind growing sharper." Having the right mentality was something that Barney realised quickly in his boxing career, and he said the greatest defensive weapon is a keen mind, the ability to take command of the battle. Only a small part of a champion's greatness lies in his ability. Far more important is his eagerness to learn, his flair for adding finesse and polish to his style. Great words for Barney.
Now, Chicago was a tough circuit in these days, with many boxing clubs scattered around the city, so instead of sticking with the one gym, he would fight 3 or 4 times a week. He would fight midweek at Johnny Cowland's or Izzy Klein's clubs, in Kid Howard's gym on Saturday nights, and Friday nights he'd fight in the Edmale Heath Club on Roosevelt Road and Kedzie Avenue, a gym owned by the Capone-connected referee David Yiddles Miller. Now he would earn about $10 to $15 a week collecting watches, medals or pairs of shoes that he would pawn. And by 1926, at the age of 16, he was fighting as a bantamweight and had gained a reputation as a scrapper in the ring with fast hands and a solid chin. Now, although still under the legal age required by the State Athletic Commission, he lied about his date of birth, something many fighters did back then, something we talked about with Sugar Ray Robinson. Another sign of the times was for young fighters to keep their boxing secret from their mothers, and that's exactly what Barney did. However, he did tell his older brothers, Ben and Maury, and he sometimes got permission for his younger brothers, George and Sammy, to leave the orphanage and sit in the front row during a few of his amateur bouts. Now, before Barney was 18, his mother made a recovery and returned to Chicago. Barney, Maury and Sarah moved into a small apartment on Roosevelt Road. He would sometimes return home after boxing, a little bit beat up, but he would insist that he had fallen over. Now, another trait in these days was to hide your birth name, just in case his mum stumbled across an article, the better that he became. Maury had boxed briefly also as an amateur using the last name Ross, so Barney Rosowski accepted the hand-me-down name, and that's how he became Barney Ross.
There you go. Great. I love that. The old days, they just keep it from their mums. Obsessed with keeping it from their mums. Just always makes me laugh, and changing their name. So many fighters did that. As you say, Sugar Ray. It became harder for Barney to hide his boxing career, especially because he was getting a name for himself on the West Roosevelt Road. So it wasn't long until his mum discovered the truth. Now, his brother George remembered his mum's disapproval because of her strong religious beliefs. To her, a fighter was nothing but a Yiddish bum. Her values were recited in the 1924 silent film about the life of a Jewish boxer. And she said, these are the words, a box fighter. So that's what you want to become? For this, we come to America, so that you should become a box fighter. Better you should be a gangster or even a murderer. The shame of it, a box fighter. So that's from the film, but that was the type of values that, you know, many Jewish parents had with their, just anyone that had, you know, that was a follower of certain religious beliefs, that, you know, boxing just was, it was like the devil. So naturally, she would eventually make a U-turn on her perception of being a boxer. But for now, Barney assured her that he was only fighting to make enough money to get his younger brothers and sister out of the orphanage and back under the same roof. Now, in the winter of 1929, as Barney Ross was training to enter the Golden Gloves tournament at the Edmale Heath Club on Kedzie Avenue, owned by, as you mentioned earlier, Capone's man, David Miller, underneath the gym was a restaurant where numerous notorious gangland figures would meet. Barney, by his own admission, was still dabbling in a life of petty crime, running errands for West Side bookmakers and bootleggers. On February 14, Al Capone ordered the assassination of the North Side boss, George Bugs Moran, but his understudies failed. Instead, they slaughtered 7 men in the SMC Cartage Company garage in North Clark Street. Barney Ross later claimed that St. Valentine's Day massacre meant more to me than it did to most people, since apparently he knew each and every one that was murdered personally.
Wow. That's a very infamous moment in that era as well. A very infamous moment in the world of gangsterism as well. It's something when you do a lot of research into these gangsters of this era, this was huge. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when you think of it in boxing terms, you think of obviously Sugar Ray and you think of Jake LaMotta, and the reason you obviously look at that particular fight and how battered and beaten up, they referred to that particular incident because of how much of a beating it was for Jake LaMotta, and it actually originated from this St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, Barney Ross, he entered, as we said, into the 1929 Golden Gloves at featherweight, 126 pounds, fighting in the stable of Miller's Chicago Tribune. Now, in front of a crowd of 9,000 in the Coliseum, Barney scored a knockout over a fighter named Mike Pallard. He then beat Art Donovan on points in the semi-finals, and then he won the Golden Gloves Championships on points over Jackie Davis. Now, following his victory, it was decided that all the Chicago winners from all weights would fight the New York champions in a single night of head-to-head matchups to determine the Intercity champions. Now, just before the bout, his trainer Jack Isle told the Chicago Tribune that Ross is a self-made boxer. When he came to our club, he showed little ability. He was willing to learn and never flinched when he was hit. I showed him how to jab and hook with his left and how to clinch. Now, the Intercity tournament was held at the Mecca of boxing, Madison Square Garden, in front of a capacity crowd of 20,000 people, and apparently 15,000 more had actually had to be turned away at the door. Now, Barney's New York opponent was Al Santora, and Barney remembered this night very well, and he said, "I didn't feel very good when I started for the ring. The two Chicago boys just ahead of me had both lost and come back to the dressing room in tears." Now, it was a hard battle for Ross, but he fought hard, and after 3 rounds, it was judged to a draw. Those in charge ordered a 4th tiebreaker round. Now, although Barney was barely able to lift his arms, he managed to do enough to win the featherweight Intercity title. Now, he was interviewed later by the Ring magazine, and he said, "That fight taught me something I will never forget, that no matter how bad off you may be, the other fellow may be worse."
Bang on. Like, by the sounds of it, as you mentioned, he can't even lift his hands, the kid, and he's still just through him no matter what. And obviously the other guy's struggling too, and he comes away with a victory. Impressive. So much talk was now turned to Barney Ross turning professional, but he was only interested in one goal. And he said, "I became a pro for the same reason I became an amateur. I had no hopes or goal of a big time success. My objective was to keep going until I could put enough money away to bring the kids out of the orphanage and support them till they were old enough to support themselves." To prepare Barney for his inevitable turnover to the pros, he had an exceptional stablemate and a mentor who was 3 years his senior and the undisputed world welterweight champion, and that was Jackie Fields. Fields hired Barney at the rate of $5 a round to work as his sparring partner to prepare him just as much as teaching Barney Ross the tricks of the trade. Now, he told a sports writer, Ira Burku, in 1975, now this is he as in Jackie Fields, "I take pride in saying I was a good teacher to him. I told him to stay in shape because half the guys can't go 10 rounds at top speed. And if you can, you're the boss. I'd say get your hands up a little higher or jab it out a little stronger instead of tapping. I taught him to be careful of the stooges around you. They hang with you because you're Barney Ross. They'll suck your blood." Barney began his professional boxing career on the undercard of a Fields fight against a Mexican fighter named Ray Lugo on September 1st, 1929 at a half-empty Main Street gym, which was a bit bewildering to him after being in front of sort of 20-odd thousand, and all of a sudden he's hardly anyone there. You know, it was different for him. And he won a 6-round points decision in front of a very hostile crowd that shouted anti-Semitic slurs. He earned $75 for that win. A week later, he picked up his second win in the same gym against Joe Barola, earning $100.
So 2 fights down and 2 wins in the bag, Barney returned to Chicago. Davey Miller made a decision that would have longevity for the rest of his career when he teamed him up with Pye and Winch. Now, Sam, as in Pye Pian, was Jewish and the businessman, while Art Winch was the cornerman with the Italian descent. Now, for the next 3 years, Barney knuckled down and he worked hard, fighting on undercards in Knights of Columbus halls and arenas around the Midwest. He won a string of featherweight and lightweight fights, knocking out Young Terry and Harry Dublin Sky, including fights with Lou Perez and Petey Mack. He was earning $100 a fight and managed to save enough to get his mum a larger apartment, but not enough to get Ida, Sam and George out of the orphanage. Pye and Winch had him train at George Tafton's gym, a 5th floor prize fighting club. Now the 4th floor was a bookies, which was run by a Jewish gangland figure, Charles Babe Baron. Now within 2 years, Barney Ross had acquired a respectable record of 18, 1 and 2. His sole loss came against Mexican veteran Carlos Garcia by a 6-round decision. Now the Chicago Tribune wrote on March 20th, 1931, Barney Ross, outstanding Chicago lightweight of the present season, appears for the second time in a Cicero Stadium headliner tonight when he meets Jackie Davis. Now he went on to beat Davis over 6 rounds, but he had fought and won his first 10-rounder the month before against young Terry for a second time. A week after the Davis win, Barney was reported as losing for the second time in his career by the Chicago Tribune against Roger Bernard, who had a much experienced record of 42, 8 and 3.
So that would be Barney's last defeat in 3 years, as he reeled off 15 straight victories with 3 knockouts. Now, at the Chicago Stadium, Barney fought on the undercard of Battling Battaglino against Dick Sisk, who was a 24-2-1 guy. Now, he was eager to demonstrate his superior boxing skills, knocking down Sisk in the first round before finishing him off in the 6th. 2 months later, at the Sparta Stadium in Chicago, he picked up back-to-back knockouts when he stopped Henry Perlich, who hit the decks twice in the first round and once in the second, with the referee stopping the bout when the bell rang for the 3rd round. On August 26, 1932, he outpointed Ray Miller over 10 rounds. A month later, he picked up a 2nd round stoppage against Frankie Petroli, and then that 37th victory earned him his first main event at the Chicago Stadium on October 21st, 1932 against Battling Battaglino, who was 42, 17 and 2, a former featherweight champion. At the tender age of just 22, in front of a crowd of 11,349, Barney outpointed Christopher Battaglino over 10 rounds, taking a unanimous decision. It was reported after the bout that Battaglino had actually suffered a broken nose, which shelved him for several months. The United Press wrote about this important victory, and they said it placed him in line for a lightweight title bout with the then champion Tony Canzonieri before the end of the winter season.
Then, on March 22nd, 1933, at the Chicago Coliseum, Barney won a 10-round decision over the number 1 lightweight contender, the future Hall of Famer and brother of Frankie Billy the Fargo Express Petroli. Now, Arch Ward of the Chicago Tribune predicted it looks like young Barney Ross, whose real name is Rozovsky, can't escape the 135-pound championship. That victory over Billy Petroli set up a match with the world lightweight and junior welterweight champion Tony Canzonieri, who was 96, 12 and 8. Now this would be the first encounter of a terrific rivalry that featured 3 fighters from 3 different ethnic backgrounds. Now Barney Ross, of course, born in New York, raised in Chicago with Jewish heritage, and the pride of the ghetto, tough Tony Canzonieri, an Italian-American from Brooklyn by way of New Orleans. And then, the 3rd fighter in the mix was Jimmy the baby-faced assassin McLernan. Originally from County Down, Ulster, now fighting out of Vancouver, British Columbia. Now all 3 would dominate the lighter weight divisions in the 1930s, and their rivalry caused so much interest in the lower divisions due to its competitiveness, overshadowed the marquee heavyweight division. Now, with each boxer's management team playing the ethnic card to hype the fights, Barney refused to embrace their racial stance. He went against the grain of Jewish fighters by not wearing the Star of David on his shorts, like his idol Benny Leonard did, and what Max Baer did in the heavyweight division. Instead, he wore basic shorts with BR engraved, but he did make his way to the ring to the tune of My Yiddish Mama, to the delight of his mum, who by now would sit ringside and support her son to the hilt.
Great stuff, and what a fantastic rivalry here. Tony Canzonieri, obviously this is the first fight for Barney. So Tony Canzonieri had turned over to the professional ranks as a teenager in Brooklyn and was featherweight champion of the world before Barney Ross even entered the Golden Gloves. Now, although his date of birth was questionable, he was on paper only 1 year older than Barney, who wrote in Fundamentals of Boxing about his unorthodox style. So this is Barney Ross explaining Canzonieri. And he said Canzonieri had an unorthodox style. He kept his guard down and he waved his face about, offering a teasing target. But he alone knew how to handle himself in that setup in such a way that there was no danger to him. He alone knew how to take his face away in the nick of time and pummel his foe freely when the chance presented itself. As Benny Leonard often said, do not be an imitation of a man like Canzonieri, at least not a bad imitation. His tricks will probably die with him. Well, to be fair, unbeknown to Benny Leonard, he obviously he wasn't to know that, Canzonieri's style would not die, and many fighters have that blueprint today and even before. Well, the first thing I think about is like a Prince Nazim. I think that was the sort of style that Canzonieri had. Now, the Italian-American was the current two-weight world champion, and that Fleischer Ring magazine, in their opinion, had him as the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Ross and Canzonieri squared off for the first time on Friday, June 23rd, 1933, in a 10-round bout at the Chicago Stadium. Now, the fight was billed as Chicago's premier World's Fair fistic attraction, with tickets ranging from $2.40 to $7.50, with the official attendance being listed as 11,204. Little George and Sammy, well, they were let out of the orphanage on a chaperone furlong so they could attend the fight. Ma Rozovsky was in attendance, making sure she attended the Sabbath before the fight. And Sarah had become part of the fight's promotion as well, with one cartoonist actually portraying the Ross and Canzonieri championship belt as a war between the Jewish and Italian mothers. She and her son sat 7 or 8 rows back, and the ringside seats being filled by politicians, celebrities, and of course those silk-suited gangsters from the Capone organization and Jewish gamblers. It was a big deal and a big fight.
Now, on the day of the fight, Canzonieri was the 6-5 favourite due to having more knockout power, but Barney had the better ring craft, the more classic boxer style. This was the biggest fight to be staged in Chicago since the infamous Tunney Dempsey long count championship fight at Soldier Field. Decades later, sports writer Jack Griffin described Barney Ross's form at his peak, and he said, "A slim kid with glossy patent leather hair, he had the movement of a ballet dancer. The left would come out hooking, jabbing, and then that right, cocked against his cheek, would fire straight on target." The Chicago Tribune wrote this, and they said, "The fight was razor sharp and was filled with action. No title fight in Chicago was better fought. Ross certainly landed more blows because of his great left jab and excellent defence, but Canzonieri was stronger and the harder hitter and forced the fight." Now, by all accounts, it would seem that Canzonieri was in control after the first 6 rounds, with Barney cut on both eyes and blood streaming down his face and unable to see. Now, the Ring magazine's reporter was Frank Maestro, and he reported, "Nevertheless, the dark-eyed, raven-haired Chicago lad, with the fire of youth and ambition in his eyes, suddenly found inspiration and lashed a 2-fisted attack that turned the trick for him." Now, it was a very close 10-rounder, but the judges, William Batty and Edward Hintz, scored the fight for Barney Ross, while referee Tommy Gilmore saw it a draw. Barney Ross had become the first Golden Gloves winner to win a professional title, and the first boxer in history to ever capture 2 titles in one night of fighting. Canzonieri and New York sports writers complained that Ross had got a home decision, but the decision would never change, and Barney was now a dual world champion, holding the lightweight and the junior welterweight belts at the same time.
Impressive stuff. The first Golden Gloves winner to win a professional world title. I think the next one after that was Joe Louis. I'm sure it was. The former champion Canzonieri, he picked up the larger portion of the fight's income, taking home $30,000. Barney, on the other hand, he earned the most money he'd ever earned in his career so far, which was $11,000 for the night. Now, he was true to his word. With his winnings, he bought his mum a 6-room apartment in a well-to-do area and got his siblings out of that orphanage. Now, it took several months to do so, but Ida was first, followed by Sam and then Georgie, and this happened around January 1933, and the family was finally reunited under one roof again. Barney had brought his family back together again with that one night of fighting. He also became a celebrity overnight, and all of a sudden, he was the cream of the crop. Al Capone, well, he had been jailed on tax evasion conviction, and he had become an inmate in Alcatraz, but his brothers Ralph and Matty were huge fans of Barney Ross, as were other organised crime heavies like Frank Nitti, Murray the Camel Humphreys, the Fischetti brothers, Julius Loving Putty Annixter. Well, he was a Jewish gambling kingpin who actually gifted Ross an expensive watch for defeating Tony Canzonieri. Not all of the mobsters were actually happy with Barney's win, and Charles Bay Barron, aka the Colonel, who run that sports bookies on the 4th floor, which you mentioned earlier, Sean, in the same building on Tafton's gym. Well, he had a close relationship with Tony Canzonieri, and he lost an absolute fortune on betting on his mate. Now, it has been suggested, whether it's true or not, I don't really think so personally, but it's been suggested that his cronies, as in the Colonel's cronies, he persuaded Barney Ross to take the immediate rematch by using strong arm tactics. Now, to be fair, this rumour does seem a little far-fetched, considering that the fact that Barney never ducked a single fight throughout his whole career. Plus, it's also suggested that he insisted on the rematch taking place in New York just to clear up any lingering doubts that he may have benefited from that hometown decision. Now, before the rematch, Barney fought a mandatory defence of the junior welterweight title against Johnny Farr a month after winning the title, which he won by a 6th round knockout. Now, Pye and Witch then agreed to a rematch, and the rematch was to happen on September 12, 1933, in front of more than 50,000 people that included politicians, the whole New York Giants American football team, who I believe were dressed in all their attire, were actually directing people to their seats, and Babe Ruth at the Polo Grounds. Babe Ruth sitting ringside as well. The only thing his team demanded was that they wanted Barney Ross to get $30,000 guaranteed.
Now, when the first bell sounded, they went at each other like a train. It was a frantic pace, with neither fighter willing to back down. It was to and fro, with both fighters hurting each other at some point, although neither buckled under the pressure. Canzonieri lost rounds 6, 8 and 9 due to low blows, which definitely affected the final result. Now, Paul Gallico wrote in the New York Daily News that Barney outslugged Tony, beat him in the rallies and exchanges, made him stop, and who came blazing back when stung or hurt, so much so that he offset every advantage that Tony could get. Now, the 15th and final round was a battle to the bell. Both men went for broke, but neither hit the canvas at any time. They stayed on the feet until the final bell went. Now, the two judges couldn't be split. George Kelly, he scored the fight for Canzonieri. Harold Barnes for Ross, and the referee Arthur Donovan cast the deciding vote for the winner, and still lightweight champion of the world, Barney Ross. Now, Canzonieri's elderly father, he climbed into the ring, he grabbed a stool and he was trying to hurl it at one of the judges when he was muscled away by a policeman. Clearly not happy with that decision, of course. Now, there were no excuses this time and no home decision, and Gallico wrote that the new champion is the better man. He moved into the enemy's own territory and took him at a longer distance. He matched him at every turn and then beat him. Beat him at boxing, but chiefly beat him at fighting. Now, the victory turned Ross into an even bigger star, which attracted, of course, many dodgy characters. And he also had this weakness, Barney Ross, and it was for alcohol, cigarettes, and women. But the biggest problem he had was his addiction to gambling.
When Barney wasn't fighting in the ring or training for a fight, he would spend all of his time at the racetrack. The trouble with his addiction was that he didn't know when to stop, and he would put large sums of bets down, but worst of all, he was actually really terrible at it. He didn't know about horses whatsoever, so he lost a shitload of money. Back to the boxing, and to end 1933, Barney successfully defended his junior welterweight title in a 10-round majority decision against Sammy Fuller. To kickstart 1934, he fought Billy Petroli for the second time in a non-title fight. Now, He was at his brilliant best this night. He won 8 of those 10 rounds against Petroli, and it was his last, as in Petroli's last professional bout, and it was at the New York Coliseum. And after the defeat, Billy Petroli, he was humble in his post-fight interview, and he said, "Did you ever see a dream fighting? Well, I did. That is when Barney didn't have that left glove in front of my face. That boy is a marvel. He's got everything. He'll be a lightweight champion until he's old, as I am, if he doesn't grow out of the division." Great words there, and he was obviously outstanding. After the bout, Pye and Winch, they forwarded a guaranteed $35,000 to a certain Jimmy McLaren for a McLaren and Ross welterweight title bout. Now, while waiting for the fight to be confirmed, Ross defeated Pete Nabo convincingly in Kansas City, but almost lost his junior welterweight title on May 5th, 1934 against Frankie Click, an 81 and 10 and 11 guy. Now, it was a very controversial decision, as explained by Harry B. Smith of the San Francisco Chronicle. Most saw Ross winning. We scored the bout 7-2 to 1 for Ross, but the verdict, well, it was a draw. 9 days later, he was back in the ring for another defense of the junior welterweight title, but this time there was no controversy. The Reno Evening Gazette wrote, "Ross gave Kid Moro of the Philippine Islands a boxing lesson to win an easy 10-round decision."
Now, 2 weeks later, he outpointed Bobby Pasho. He was 47, 15 and 7 over 10 rounds in LA. Now, Barney probably won't remember the fight too much, but he certainly won't forget it in a hurry. Now, Ross went out with some fake Hollywood friends and blew his entire purse on betting. And he later said, "My credit was good with every bookie in the country, but I could no longer cover my losses." Now, he told Pye and Winch that he needed another blockbuster bout just to get himself back in the black. Barney was now the best lightweight in the world, and there were no obvious choices to get him that big money fight. So he vacated his lightweight title on April the 15th, 1935, and moved up to face the welterweight champion. Now, Damon Runyon wrote this on the confirmed fight in the Chicago Herald-American, and he said, "The greatest stir in many years of pugilistic history is created by the signing of Barney Ross, lightweight champion, and Jimmy McLaren, welterweight champion. This match is a ringworm's dream that few expected to see realised." Now, Ross is undoubtedly the greatest lightweight since Benny Leonard, last of the lightweight champions to make a bid for the welterweight title. McLaren is one of the all-time ring stars, a dynamite puncher who has for some years been feasting on fighters smaller than himself. But most of them were in terror of him before they even entered the ring. No China Chin chicken heart awaits him here when he faces the laughy, swift-moving boy from Chicago. It looks as if the little fellows may at last be thoroughly avenged. Now, in New York City, as the Toronto Globe and Mail later reported, McLaren was the toast of Broadway, hobnobbing with Mayor Jimmy Walker, teaching Babe Ruth to box over drinks at Dinty Moore's, and eating a slice of lemon pie with a gangster named Legs Diamond. That just goes to show you the sort of sway that McLaren had at this time. So not only was Barney Ross a big celebrity, so was Jimmy McLaren.
It's just great, and obviously Tony had his connections as well, didn't he? The three of them they really were the toast of the box of 30s boxing. Really, there was just they made it lively again. They got people behind. I mean, and the fact is, Barney was lightweight moving up to welterweight. I mean, you wouldn't even think about that today. I mean, you just think off the top of your head of that's like Lomachenko, lightweight fighting who at welterweight? I don't know. Terence Crawford. It seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? Really, but in addition to his baby-faced assassin nickname, as in McLaren this is, he had also became known as the Jew beater, the Jew nemesis, and the Scrooge of the fighting sons of Israel, after he dispatched in relatively short time Kid Kaplan, Ruby Goldstein, Al Singer, Joe Glick, Joey Sagner, Jackie Fields, and Sig Terrace, all of them obviously Jewish fighters, and he got rid of them all. And the ultimate victory of them all, McLaren knocked out the most revered of all modern Jewish pugilists, The ring wizard himself, Benny Leonard, obviously he was over the hill. He's 36 years old and having to fight on after losing all of his money in the stock market. Check out Ray Arcel's career profile. We're going a little bit more detail with that. But Barney Ross, he was fighting for more than a title. He was fighting for his fellow Jewish citizens. And a columnist in the ring summed up the pressure on Barney Ross when he wrote, "It seems that the Jewish race stands a better chance than ever to avenge the KOs administered to its boys, although I think that Barney has bitten off more than he can chew and will be taken into camp by the Fighting Irishman." Pye and Winch, well, they moved their training camp to Round Lake, Illinois, or the forests of Wisconsin's to Grosvenor's Catskills Resort up in New York, which is the Catskills. I believe it is where Cuss took Tyson and many of his fighters. Now, Barney was the first to train in the Catskills, and as I said, Rocky Marciano, Ingemar Johansson went up there, Floyd Patterson, and obviously Mike Tyson. Sports writers Damon Renyard and Grantland Rice, Jimmy Cannon, Red Smith, they all visited the camp and they jotted down every detail of his road work, his hundreds of sit-ups, and the damage he was inflicting on his sparring partners. Barney apologising when he actually dazed one of them, and an Art Winch yelling at him, saying to him, "What the hell are you saying sorry to him for?" Hit him. All these great little stories we picked up from some of these sports writers. And while in camp, attention soon turned to what the Germans were doing to the Jewish in Poland. And although it must have struck fear in Barney and many Jewish people in the world, it also inspired him to box with passion, and he never felt ever anything like it before. The news from Germany had filled him with a new sort of resolve that made him feel, in his own words, like I was fighting for all my people. McClellan, well, as you mentioned, Sean, he had that great Irish heritage, and a ring columnist suggested that he was an absolute godlike idol with the Irish.
Now, the first fight was held on May the 28th, 1934, in the Madison Square Garden Bowl in Long Island City, promoted as a benefit for Mrs. William Randolph Hearst's Free Milk Fund for Babies, Inc. Now, the gate receipts totaled $210,000, which was considered a small fortune given the bleak boxing economics of the Depression years. The official attendance was listed as 60,000, which included Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, and the Jewish boxing contingent of Ruby Goldstein, Battling Levinsky, Abe Attell, Jackie Field, and of course the godfather of them all, Benny Leonard. This was the largest crowd for a non-heavyweight fight since the epic Benny Leonard-Lou Tendler bouts of 1922 and 1923. The New York Times reported their bout as a bitterly, systematically, and at times savagely waged. And it was even a battle that Ross was just about shading with his rallies late in the rounds, which impressed the judges. That was until the 9th, when McLennan saw an opening and landed a shot left hook that sent Ross to the canvas. Now, he sprung up before the referee could even commence the count, and he recalled, "No one had ever counted over me in a prize ring, and I wasn't about to let them start now." 20 seconds later, Barney landed a right hand that sent McLaren into the canvas, and he too was back on his feet before a count could begin. Going into the 15th round, this was a classic, with both fighters trading punches in close quarters before collapsing into a clinch and continuing to pound each other's bodies. In the final seconds, Ross buckled McLennan's knees with a clean shot just below the heart. McLennan stayed upright and desperately tried to land the heavy right hand, but Ross blocked or slipped all his punches while pounding McLennan hard with his own right hand at the sound of the bell. Joe Humphreys began the announcement. The winner and the new welterweight champion of the world, but his voice was drowned out by the roaring Madison Square Garden Bowl. Barney Ross had done it, and he said after the fight as tears rolled down his cheeks, "This fight meant so much to me. If I'd have lost it, I'd have died." Now, filled with pride, Barney Ross was greeted to a hero's welcome in Chicago from the moment he arrived home on the train. He met his mother and brothers before climbing into an open-top car that escorted him through the Chicago streets as his fans cheered their hero. Gene Morgan of the Chicago Daily News wrote, "He came home today, home to the arms of his adoring Chicago. Barney Ross, thrice crowned Emperor of Fisdom, whose Alexander the Greatness has won him 3 fighting titles within a year. It was a welcome such as only Chicago contender to a native son who has added to the city's achievement in science, literature, music, or jaw-busting.
Jaw-busting, love it. Fantastic. I mean, what an amazing fight. You know, all these fights that we've just gone through here so far, the Canzonieri fights and the Jimmy fight there, absolutely outstanding fights. And they do get better, believe it or not. I mean, the footage isn't quite there on YouTube. There is some of it, but there is, you know, from what you read, and, you know, I think you've probably got to go and purchase these fights if you want to see them, but they are out there. But during the celebrations, with champagne still flowing, the negotiations for a rematch was in place. Once again, the second fight would be staged at the Long Island City's Madison Square Garden Bowl. The fight was first delayed by rain and then by the Jewish New Year festival because Barney Ross refused to fight or train during the High Holy Days. Now, it was finally rescheduled on September 17, 1934, and it was in front of 25,000 this time, a little bit less, and a gate receipt of, again, a little less, $150,000. Barney went into the fight as the 11-5 favourite and 6 pounds lighter than McLennan. The second fight was just as engaging as the first, with both fighters exchanging savagely for large chunks of their battle. The only difference was their styles were a complete flip reversal, with Ross being the more aggressive and McLaren being the more calculated fighter and fighting on the inside and looking to steal rounds. Nat Fleischer wrote in the Ring magazine, Barney actually outpunched the famous hitter, McLaren, no matter what the judges or the judging officials thought about it. And the reason why he said that is 22 of the 38 sports writers covering the bout actually scored the fight a Barney Ross victory. But it was McLennan who got the split decision this time, which was greeted with a storm of boos in protest, the Associated Press wrote. You can't help but think a home decision was handed to McLennan, especially as both judges and the referee were apparently of Irish descent as well. The Associated Press wrote this assessment of the fight. It seemed to a majority of the experts around the ringside that little Barney Ross at least earned a draw in the dazzling duel that shifted first in one direction and then the other, then back and forth again through the entire 15 blistering rounds. There were no knockdowns, although McLennan, his left eye completely closed, his nose trickling with blood, his lips split, slipped twice in the 15th with sheer weariness. Ross taking more of the Irishman's right hand smashes than any other warrior ever did and survived, was equally battered. But by the sounds of it, once again, it's a very, very good fight, tough fight, but overshadowed by dodgy decisions, which is, this is in the 30s, it still happens today.
It sounds like it was probably best scored as a draw. By the sounds of what the writers wrote around that time, you can tell from what the writers are saying. I mean, you look at the experts that were there, pretty much the majority of the experts at ringside or the ringside press were giving this fight to Barney Ross. So they're not the judges at the end of the day, it's the judges that matter. But still, you know, if the majority of people around are seeing this, surely the judges that are watching it at our ringside are seeing something, but clearly they didn't. They're seeing something different. Yeah. Maybe the Irish descent had something to do with it. Maybe it makes you wonder, doesn't it? But, you know, this led to what was going to be inevitable, and it was the rubber match, and it was scheduled for May the 28th, 1935, the 1-year anniversary of the first McLaren-Ross fight, and it was to be staged in the Polo Grounds in front of 45,000 fans with Jack Dempsey, of all people, as the referee. But before Barney would enter the ring for a third time against McLaren, he decided to navigate his way through his last 3 defences of the junior welterweight title. First, it was a second meeting with Bobby Pascho in his last fight of 1934, taking a well-earned 12-round points decision over the Californian in Cleveland. His next defence was in Miami against Frankie Click, who he knocked down in the second round with a vicious right to the chin en route to a unanimous decision. The third and final defence of the junior welterweight title came 3 months later due to Barney picking up an illness, but determined just not sit around and wait for the McLennan fight, he headed to Washington and took on Henry Woods, who was 62-4. Now, Barney Ross floored Woods in the thirds, twisting his ankle as he fell, but the challenger valiantly battled on to the end. And Barney did what he had to do, and he boxed his way to another unanimous decision over 12 rounds. He then vacated the junior welterweight title after the fight, with Jimmy McClellan's welterweight strap his main priority. Now, to make sure that there would be no controversy surrounding their third duel, Payan and Winch negotiated for a Jewish official named Abe Goldberg. Now, Barney was quicker, more aggressive, and he actually rocked McLennan several times. Henry McLenmore of the United Press explains his version of events of that fight, and he said, for 15 rounds, McLennan threw every punch he had and executed every trick learned in years and years of fighting the best of them. But it wasn't enough. When the boys came out for the 12th, it was anybody's fight, and you knew that the title and the gold and the glory that goes with it rested on what happened from there out. Now, Ross actually broke a bone in his left hand in the 6th round, but yet he still managed to fight on. Now, the 15th was special. Both fighters once again threw caution to the wind and pounded each other until they fell into each other's arms. They had given absolutely everything and were completely shattered by the time the final bell rang. The decision was unanimous. Abe Goldberg 6-8, George Lecron 4-9, and Jack Dempsey 5-7, all in favour of the new welterweight champion of the world, Barney Ross.
Oh, what I mean, you can. There's so many different descriptions of that 15th round. The fight itself's got so many. There's even quite a bit of footage on it. I think there's even one in colour. I'm sure it was the third one, but when they're literally going for it in that last round, like you know, the one thing I always remember is the bulbs busting, because back then, you know, the big cameras, all the bulbs were just flashing and busting on them, and it was just such a big deal. It was a huge fight, and it was the best of the lot by the sounds of it. So, you know, if anyone's got any full footage of that, send it mine and Sean's way, because we'd love to actually watch the whole thing. But impressive stuff from both fighters. And well, Barney was 26 when he won the welterweight title for the second time. The third encounter with McLennan is considered by many sports writers and observers as the best of the lot. Although still young, he had an impressive record of 57 wins with only 3 losses and 3 draws. That's Barney Ross's record, of course. And nobody would have blamed him, as many were saying, if he'd have called it a day. Interesting, 26, but people were still saying, you know, it took a lot. There's a lot of fighting going on in such a short space of time. And that McClellan trilogy, as well as the Canzonieri fights, as well as other fights. But his gambling continued to get out of hand, and he was losing more than he was earning, and he had to return. So he sort of pondered retirement. I think that's basically what happened. But after 4 months out of the ring, he did make his return, and he fought a guy called Baby Joe Gans with a crazy record: 125 wins, 22 defeats, and 12 draws. And he fought him in Portland, Oregon. A lightning left to the jaw 10 seconds after the bell opened. The second round ended the fight. 1 week later, he was in San Francisco, where he took on the tough Philippine Seferino Garcia, 75-9 in the 9. Now, it started badly when he was knocked down twice with bolo punches in the first round. Now, the expression "saved by the bell" could not be more apt, as the Oakland Tribune wrote that while hurt, Ross slid down the ropes till he was sitting on one of the rope strands. He arose without a count and was immediately knocked down again by a right hand. The bell to end the first round clanged, and he was just about to rise from the canvas as it did. Now, apparently, when he was in his corner as well, his trainer actually lit a match and put it against him to try and liven him up. That's a new technique. I've never heard of that one before. And he asked him what round it was as well, the more the fight went on. And he said, well, it's the end of the first. And his trainer said, no, it's the end of the 5th. So he must have been really stunned. Even though he was so badly stunned, he did manage to recover. He must have been that street fighting instinct inside him, because he actually went on, by most observers that say he won 8 of the 9 remaining rounds. So he must have been literally still sort of unconscious, not really knowing what's going on, and still managing to win rounds. But 2 months later, Barney took the rematch in Chicago, but this time it was a much more convincing display, taking a clear points decision with no knockdowns this time. Barney Ross fought 6 times in 1936, winning all 6, with 4 coming by way of knockout. His win over Laddie Tonielli in Milwaukee was described by the Associated Press as a boxing mastery. So he was still sort of at his peak, but he was fading, even though he's coming up to like 28, mid-late 20s. His last fight to end the year was a welterweight title defense against Izzy Janazano. Who he actually hit the canvas in the 2nd and the 5th rounds, en route to a Barney Ross unanimous decision.
Now, Barney Ross, he was still too good for the rest of the division, and most did feel like he was at the peak of his powers. There was no more Tony Canzonieri's or Jimmy McClellan's to test Ross, and he began to slack in training. He began to smoke, he continued to gamble, and drink straight vodka to cover the smell of alcohol from his breath. Now, he did invest in a jewellery store and was seriously beginning to consider what he was going to do after boxing. He fought only 5 times in 1937, winning 2 by stoppage against much lesser opposition. He gave a young fighter in El Manfredo a boxing lesson twice, sandwiched between those victories were 2 knockout wins over Chuck Woods and Jackie Burke. Now, to end 1937, Barney took on Seferino Garcia for the 3rd time at promoter Mike Jacobs' Carnival of Champions. The New York Times reported, "In as masterful an exhibition of boxing as admirable a demonstration of fighting courage and as determined a stand a champion has flashed in recent years, Ross matched his wits against the power of his challenger's punches and won the unanimous decision." Now, the night of the fight, Barney lost his entire $18,000 purse on a single bet. And now he continued to loan his so-called friends thousands, and he actually got a reputation for over-tipping. Now, he also knew how to spend. He was always dressed so immaculately in a tailored suit, silk pocket square with matching socks, and he was dripping with gold. Now, during the win over Garcia, he actually broke his left hand, which resulted in 7 months out of the ring. And during that break from the ring, just before his 28th birthday, Barney Ross married his first wife, Pearl Siegel, on December the 5th, 1937, at the Congress Hotel in Chicago. They returned from their European honeymoon and pitched up at a luxury apartment in New York City.
Now, he began 1938 with 2 straightforward knockout wins against average guys before making his last defence of that welterweight title against one of the finest fighters to ever grace the ring and the then featherweight champion of the world, Henry Armstrong, with a record of 89-11-7. Now listen to this. Henry Armstrong was on an amazing winning streak. 37 wins with 35 by way of knockout. He was an absolute machine in glorious form. Even with his amazing record, Barney Ross actually still went into this fight as a 5-2 favourite, mainly due to the size difference. Armstrong had been fighting 126 pounds, and many believed that the jump to 147 was a step too far, especially against Barney Ross, who had a record as, at the time, 74-3-3. Now, as they say, a good big man will always beat a good little man. The press tried to hype the fight with the race card using Barney's father's murder by the 2 African-American men as the reason for a race round, a disliking to Armstrong, which was a load of nonsense. But everyone knew Barney, he just wasn't that way inclined, and he was good friends with all sorts of people from all different ethnic backgrounds, Joe Louis being one of his closest pals at the time. The fight was agreed to take place at Madison Square Garden, Bowen, Long Island City on May 31st, 1938, after being delayed 3 times, again due to heavy rain. Now, Armstrong weighed 133 pounds and Ross 142, only an inch taller, but he did have a considerable reach advantage. In the first 4 rounds, Barney is winning the fight and keeping the aggressive Armstrong on the back foot. But when the fight swings the way of Homicide Hank, all of a sudden Barney's 80 professional fights and wars with some of the best in the 135 to 147 divisions. It just came up. It just come out of nowhere, and it came back to haunt him. His footwork just literally disappeared. His reflexes were no longer on display, and he had no option but to stand and trade with a powerful puncher. Although he might have been smaller, he was still a powerful puncher, and it's just one of those things. At 28 years old, Father Time caught up with him during a fight. It just happened. It's crazy.
Now Armstrong mercilessly pounded Ross, and by the 7th, the champion's right eye was swollen shut, and soon he was bleeding from both the nose and mouth. But the proud warrior could not be put down. In the late rounds, ringsiders shouted for the one-sided beatdown to be stopped. The defending champion's own cornermen begged Barney to let them throw in the towel, but he just angrily shook his head in response. Sampayan pleaded with Ross to stop the fight, but his response was defiant. "I'm not quitting. If you stop the fight, I'll never talk to you again." Now he was desperate to finish on his feet. Heading into the last few rounds, Art Donovan told him that he was going to stop the fight because he wasn't protecting himself. But again, Barney made it clear for the last time, "I'll never fight again after this one. I promise you that if you let me finish." Armstrong later admitted to pulling his punches for the last few rounds in respect for the champion. Armstrong obviously went on to win the fight by unanimous decision, his second championship, and obviously would also go on to become the first and only boxer to hold 3 world titles simultaneously. Now, when asked by sports writer Grantland Rice why he didn't quit, Barney Ross's response was, "Champ's privilege. A champ's got the right to choose the way he goes out." Now, Barney Ross lost the fight, but he won something more that night: pride and the gratitude of people. The next morning, Grantland Rice wrote, "Barney Ross, game to the last drop of blood, fighting the last 10 rounds on instinct and conditioning." Grown men actually cried that night, and the silence of the defeat was deafening, and Barney said, 35,000 people were sitting in silence, and I suddenly realised that this unbelievable, fantastic silence was the most wonderful tribute I had ever received.
Wow, incredible. Battered and bruised in the dressing room after the fight, Barney was true to his word, and he announced his retirement from boxing at the age of 28 with a record of 72 wins, 4 defeats and 3 draws with 22 knockouts, but with one important stat: that he had never been stopped. He was reluctant to ever be stopped, and he stood by his word. And he said, "That was my last fight, and I wasn't going to go out laying down. Armstrong is a hell of a fighter, but I would have got up if he'd have knocked me down a dozen times." Barney spent days in hospital after the fight before heading back to Chicago. And his first move was to go to work as the manager of a clothing company that was owned by his wife's dad. The press actually came to take pictures of Barney on his first day, but a desk job, it didn't suit him very well, and he left pretty quickly. He decided to then entertain sports writers at Stillman's Gym on 8th Avenue or in Toot Shaw's, a new restaurant on 51st Street. The Boxer of the Mafia, we mentioned Toot Shaw's, which was known as the Temple of the Sports Celebrity, where he was greeted by adoring fans all the time. People still wanted to know about Barney Ross and his stories. He tried a bit of acting, but ended up back in Chicago as a hotel manager, which inspired him to open his own bar. And the bar was called the Barney Ross Cocktail Lounge in 1940. His brother Ben was the manager, and he would keep a tight grip on all the books, while Barney would entertain the celebrity guests. His relationship with Pearl eventually came to an end, and they got divorced. Barney said the main reason was because she wanted kids, and he weren't interested, believing that he could never be a proper father. Now, during their separation and eventual divorce, Barney did meet another lady, Catherine Howlett, and she was a dancer that had also been married before and divorced, but she had a daughter called Noreen. Barney's life took a drastic change on the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, when an American army base was attacked by the pilots of Japanese army, killing 2,403 Americans with 1,178 wounded. It also sank 4 of the 8 US naval battleships, 188 US aircrafts were destroyed. Of course, that was the day of Pearl Harbor, and that the day after that Pearl Harbor attack, Roosevelt, he delivered his famous Day of Infirmary speech to a joint session of Congress, calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. Barney, he was in his bar and he heard it on the radio. Apparently, he was having a chat with a sports writer about Joe Louis, his pal, with how good he was. And that's when he heard it on the news, and he immediately decided to enlist in the Marine Corps.
Now, because he was nearly 33, he was initially rejected as too old, but after 60 days, he was granted an age waiver by Washington. Now, on February the 3rd, 1942, Barney Ross gave an interview about his enlisting, and he said, "I'm frank enough to admit that I don't like being a soldier, but our country needs men, and that's where I belong. And in the front lines, not the back, teaching kids how to box." He arrived in San Diego in the spring of 1942. He was the oldest beginner in the Marines, and his soldier mates called him Grandpa. And he got through the basic training with honours, and on his last day, his girlfriend, Kathy, came to San Diego so they could get married before he went off to war. Now, he started a 6-week program teaching students hand-to-hand combat, but he was not interested in keeping away from the action, and he requested that he be on the front line. His wish was granted, and he was stationed in Samoa as part of the Fleet Marine Force. Now, while in Samoa, Barney accepted a challenge from the local heavyweight in a fight, and he said, "This baby didn't mess around, and I was sort of out of practice. Nevertheless, science did the trick, and he went to sleep on the deck." That's a great story.
Fantastic.
Now, after the 3-round bout, Barney turned down the local chief's offer to marry his daughter. Now, by October of 1942, Barney was now a member of the 2nd Marine Division, and he joined with B Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines in November of 1942 in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and codenamed Operation Watchtower by the American forces. Now, on arrival, Barney crawled to the forward foxholes and replaced the 1st Division. The first night on the canal, the men in Barney's platoon lay in their foxholes with strings tied around their fingers to keep each other alert to the Japanese soldiers who were like ghosts in the darkness. During the days, Barney remembered, the sun dried us alive and the humidity was so bad I felt like I was back in a Turkish bath. Now, while serving on the ground, he witnessed battles both in the sea and in the sky.
Oh, it's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Well, the Japanese, they attempted to take back the land that the Americans had managed to occupy. And Barney said they lured out of position screaming. We stopped them with mortars, machine guns and grenades. Their dead piled up like so many hunks of meat in a butcher's store. We held them off for 4 days, then our company got orders to move up. It's madness. On the afternoon of November 18, 1942, Barney and his patrol walked into a machine gun nest, which they were able to knock out with mortars. Now, believing that the battle was done, they began to return to their company when they stumbled across a larger Japanese party, which attacked them with machine guns. Now, one of his fellow soldiers, nicknamed Whitey, well, he was shot in the chest. Barney and a former professional golfer called Dick Harvey Atkins, they crawled on their bellies, pulling Whitey along with them into cover. Atkins, Ross and 2 other Marines, Monarch and Friedman, they made a makeshift stretcher out of their tops, I believe, for Whitey, and they attempted to carry Whitey back to the Mataniku River. They had only walked a few yards when they came under fire from this Japanese machine gun once again, and Whitey was actually killed. Atkins, Monarch and Friedman, they were injured. Now, his comrades were unable to use their guns, so Barney used his 80 rounds in his machine gun and then theirs, as well as using their ammunition and their grenades. Now, while single-handedly fighting nearly 24 Japanese soldiers over the entire night, the Marine Corps later actually calculated that Barney had fired 350 rounds of ammunition. Barney said that a fallen tree had been a godsend. Bullets kept bouncing off of it. My hat was a godsend too. At least 20 bullets ricocheted off the log and my tin hat bouncing off again. I mean, it's just absolutely terrifying. During the darkness, a mortar burst and the shrapnel hit Barney in his arm and leg. He was then shot in the ankle, and the pain was so excruciating that he almost lost consciousness. Now, while trying to dress his own wounds and stop the bleeding and fight off all these Japanese soldiers, he was also trying to aid his comrades with the rainwater from the leaves and dress their wounds too. Barney actually spent 13 hours in a foxhole, suffering also with malaria and praying for himself, his comrades, and anyone else who was ready to die. He actually threw 20 grenades. Apparently, I think it's a platoon who would get 21 grenades at the time, for some reason. That's what they give you. But he threw 20 of those during the night, holding back one. And that one was, of course, for the moment that the Japanese would arrive in that foxhole to kill him.
Wow.
Lucky for him, it didn't happen.
It's an absolutely crazy but terrifying. I can't even imagine what they all went through. I can never imagine. I mean, we've talked about a little bit of the history of the Second World War, and it's always fascinated me as an individual. And to hear about professional boxer Barney Ross being so involved in it, in the sense that he wanted to be on the front line, that he ended up getting so injured, suffering from malaria, fighting off a single Japanese sort of platoon at the time, it's absolutely crazy. I honestly can't believe that this is what he went through. Now, by the time the reinforcements arrived, Friedman had bled to death. Atkins and Monarch survived, but would both need their leg amputating. And Barney, well, of course, absolute warrior, was still alive, unable to stand, but he had survived, and he actually killed all the 22 of the Japanese soldiers. Now, not only did Barney save Atkins and Monarch, but he also saved loads of others by halting the stealth attack. When Barney was told that he would be honoured for his service, his response was, "Tell him to give it to my company. This is no one-man show." Barney was taken to an aid station to heal his wounds and the malaria that he was suffering with. While being cared for, a soldier brought him a voodoo cane, which was made by Solomon Islander. Now, it was made of dark polished wood, and it was actually inset with 6 human teeth taken from slain Japanese soldiers. Now, Barney would carry it with him while on the island and during tours of the United States. When he recovered, he was sent out to the front line on 5 more occasions, helping oust the Japanese back into the jungle. Now, during his time in Guadalcanal, Ross began a lifelong friendship with the famous Father Frederick Goering, a wartime chaplain who wrote regular correspondences for Reader's Digest magazine. Now, Goering considered Ross a national treasure who defied logic when it came to bravery and the defence of principle. Ross was the only one capable of playing a temperamental organ on the tropical island, and on Christmas Eve, before he and his fellow Marines were to go into battle, Goering asked him to learn Silent Night and other Christmas songs for the troops. Now, after playing them, Goering asked Ross to play a Jewish song, and Ross played My Yiddish Mama, about a child's love for his self-sacrificing mother. Now, many of the Marines knew the melody of the song because Ross had always played it when he entered the ring. Now, when the Marines heard the lyrics, newspaper reports said they were all in tears. Again, what an absolutely brilliant story. Really heartwarming story to hear that, again, he was so well-renowned, not just because of his boxing career, but because of who he was as a man and as a human being.
Unbelievable, isn't it? This boxer that turns into an absolute hero. I mean, it's just it's unbelievable. It really is. The story is just crazy. And on February 9, 1943, that was the day when the Japanese soldiers, they all left their posts in Guadalcanal, and it was declared secure by the American soldiers. That was the end of that battle. And Barney, well, he suffered a severe malarial attack and had to be evacuated to a field hospital. And over a period of 12 days, he suffered with hallucinations, lost 30 pounds, screamed in hysteria, and had to be restrained. To release the pain, well, he was administered morphine. Barney recalls that the morphine lifted me out of the snake pit and let me climb high in the clouds. The morphine, of course, helps the pain subside. But he also learned how to inject himself while in hospital in New Zealand. Barney arrived back in San Diego on February 26, 1943. As he limped off the boat with his cane, his voodoo cane, he kneeled onto the floor and kissed the ground. And he told the New York Times, "This I vowed to do if I ever saw American soil again. Sometimes out there we're not so sure we shall." Barney Ross was awarded the America's third highest military honor, the Silver Star, as well as a presidential citation as one of America's greatest celebrity war heroes. He was honored by President Roosevelt in Rose Garden ceremony, and he also was awarded the Edward J. Neal Trophy as the Outstanding Boxer of 1942 by the Boxing Writers Association of New York.
He received his honourable discharge from the United States Marine Corps on April the 11th, 1944. Barney continued to obtain morphine from private doctors while living in Hollywood with his wife and her daughter, but when they began to refuse him, he would use street dealers, as his habit got out of hand. Now the morphine didn't just stay morphine, it moved into heroin pretty quickly, and he would sometimes spend $500 a day on the drug. He would hit the streets at night wearing sunglasses so nobody could recognise him, and he recalled, "I spent $250,000 on drugs in 4 years, and some of it was for buying silence I paid through the nose." Many of his prize assets, like the watch that Julius Loving Putty Annixter gave him for defeating Canzonieri, was pawned for pittance. Most of the money he spent on drugs was from friends, family, odd referee jobs, loan sharks, and even Jewish gangsters like Abner Longius Wilman, a notorious Newark mob boss who was a big fan of his after winning loads of money when betting on him. Now in 1936, Kathy divorced him, and it was that moment that Barney eventually got help and checked in to a recovery centre. Barney said, "A lot of kids think I'm a hell of a fighter. Well, I can't let them see me wind up as a dope fiend. I've got to beat it." And it took 4 months, but he did manage to beat his addiction. Now, while in the facility, although his brother George said it was more like a prison, he received letters of support from all his old foes, including Canzonieri, McLennan, Petroli, Surferino, and Henry Armstrong.
So once clean, he actually started to give lectures to high school students and other addicts, teenage addicts mainly, about the dangers of drug addiction, and telling one group, "I beat the habit because I wanted to, because it was that or the end. You can beat it too if you really want to." They say there's no such thing as a fully cured addict, but that's not true. I'm cured and I'm not alone. Now, his struggle against morphine addiction is the subject of the 1957 film Monkey on My Back. And this story actually inspired the song Barney Ross, which was released in 2013 by the Spanish rock band Dr. Devago on their album Imperio. Barney Ross spent his last days using his celebrity status in promotional work for casinos and other businesses. He still owned that jewelry store as well. He reunited with his second wife after their divorce, Kathy Howlett, and he was happy. He reached the 2 goals in his life, which was to reunite his family and become a world boxing champion. He wrote an autobiography titled No Man Stands Alone, and he also remained a very loyal friend that you mentioned earlier to Jack Ruby, and he actually testified as a character witness on Ruby's behalf at his trial for killing Lee Harvey Oswald.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, if anybody doesn't know who Lee Harvey Oswald was the man that shot JFK. It's as simple as that, really. If you don't know that, then now you do. But I'm pretty sure most of the guys that listen to this, the guys and girls that listen to this podcast, I think you'll pretty much know who he is. Now, Barney Ross passed away a few minutes after 10 a.m. on January the 17th, 1967 in Chicago after suffering with throat cancer. He was only 57. He was only 57 years old when he dies, but wow. that dreaded C word again coming back and taking people way, way too young. He was only 57 years of age when he passed away, but oh my God, what a hell of a legacy. What a hell of a man he was. I mean, we've gone through this story, and towards the end of the story, we're talking about the fact that he got addicted to the morphine. It led to the heroin addiction. He spent $250,000 on drugs in 4 years, and it's crazy that he did that. But it's also so nice and so heartwarming to know that he was able to kick the habit, and he was able to then preach about how to help kick that habit to other people who were in a similar position to what he once was. And oh my word, what about all the stuff that he did during his time in the armed forces? I mean, that story is just unbelievable, and it's something I genuinely didn't know about Barney Ross. I mean, I knew a lot about his achievements as a fighter. I didn't know these stories behind it, and it's been a great tale. I've really thoroughly enjoyed covering this, and I suppose just wrapping up, his accomplishments as a fighter. Of course, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, the World Boxing Hall of Fame, the Chicago and Sports Hall of Fame, the International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, and the National Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, all in 1997. He was also inducted into the Marine Corps Sports Hall of Fame in the class of 2006. And, not forgetting his actual achievements as a boxer, holding 2 titles at the same time, of course. He won 3 titles in 3 different weights. The man is a bona fide legend, not just for what he did inside the ring, but of course what he did outside of it.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, just a story from the beginning, just seeing his father get shot, that's terrifying enough. I mean, and then his mum has a mental breakdown, and, he's left, his life's in tatters. It could have gone the other way so easily. He could have been influenced by any one of those mobsters that were around at the time and were running things. There was no support network for young boys. Being that young as a teenager as well, I mean, it's crazy. Obviously, he turned to fighting and he stayed with it. And obviously, that would have been from his dad, those roots from his dad to be a good Jewish boy. Obviously, it was enough. He'd done enough, although he disciplined him probably, a little bit harshly, but I suppose that was the era. But then to even just the amount of people met along the way, it's almost like a little Forrest Gump story in a boxing tale. That's what it feels like. Yeah. So many stuff happens to this guy. It's absolutely insane. And even he became a chain smoker though after he was a heroin addict. Apparently he would smoke like 60, 80 fags a day. The dude was just a non-stop chain smoker. After obviously kicking the habit, that was probably the next thing he went for. Addicted to gambling as well. I think he just had that addictive personality, didn't he?
Yeah.
The fags were the next thing, and that was what done him. He had an ulcer in his mouth, and then it turned into throat cancer. Yes, so in the book that we used, a great source for this, which was Barney Ross, The Life of a Jewish Fighter by Douglas Century. Fantastic book. He goes and meets his brother, George, and George has got some fascinating tales about his brother as well. We could have gone on all night, Barney Ross, but just a call he made. He said to him, you see the dentist, Barney, and he had to have all his teeth removed because obviously this ulcer was turning into cancer. So all his teeth had to go. He rang his brother, and George said, "Are you all right, Barney? You sound like you got a mouthful of shit." That was his response. He's like a really old Jewish fella, but New Yorker / obviously Chicago, and just the way he explains this interview is absolutely just superb. Some funny ass stuff in it. So if anyone hasn't read that book, go and read it. It was a great source for this one, and his autobiography as well. We managed to sort of source some bits for that for the beginning years, but terrific story, Sean. What a great story.
Really great story. Really thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And I mean, we personally, I know we really enjoy doing some of the older fighters. I mean, it's probably because we get such an education on it when actually putting the research together for it. Like, you learn so much when you put this research together, and when we deliver it to you guys, when you listen to it and you come away and you think, oh, you've really enjoyed it, and you message us and you tell us you've really enjoyed it. We enjoy putting it together just as much as you enjoy listening, and we're glad that you are feeding it back to us. I've had many messages about the Jack Johnston episode, many messages about Pernell Whitaker's episode, which was a while ago, and because obviously I've been re-promoting him on the main BTR feed, people that have not picked him up before on career profiles, they're picking him up on the main feed. So it's great that they're actually getting to listen to all these different episodes that we've put together. And as you've heard, like, you've heard another great story about another absolute legendary fighter, and we've really thoroughly enjoyed putting it together. And if, again, as always, if you've enjoyed it, please do let us know. Please drop us a message at career_profiles or the main BTR Boxing pod feed on Twitter. It's BTR Boxing Podcast across Facebook and across Instagram. If you follow us on any of them platforms, please do drop us a message. Do let us know what you think about it. If you have any suggestions, of course, I've had a few suggestions recently from Tom Gallagher in particular. Tom, thank you so much for giving us a few great heavyweight fighters that we haven't already covered, which we will look to cover in the future for you. And there's so many other fighters out there that it's a podcast where we've decided not to do any seasons with. We decided that this is one that will always continuously run, because there's thousands of fighters that you probably want to hear about, thousands of different guys from over different eras that we've not already covered that we'll absolutely enjoy covering, because there's always a tale to tell. I don't think there's any one fighter where you're literally going to do a podcast on them and there's no good stories to tell about them, and this is what we love about it. So, we love it. You guys are loving it. Please keep letting us know your feedback, any recommendations, and most importantly, make sure if you're on Apple and you're using Apple that you do leave a rating and you do leave a review, because it truly, truly does help us get the word of mouth out. And a big shout out, finally, to all the patrons of the pod. You guys will have got this early as part of your early access to episodes, and we appreciate every single one of you for help developing the podcast network. If you've not already checked out the YouTube channel as well, guys, please do go and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are trying our utmost hardest to get to the 1,000 subscriber mark to help us be able to turn the podcast into a monetized podcast, which will be even more amazing and will allow us to make even more further developments. So if you've not already subscribed to it, please do go and do so, and you'll see some great little short clips coming on there from our video guy. Big shout out to Sam Beresford as well. He's our new video guy. He's going to be looking after the YouTube channel, so you're going to get some great content, different segments from all the different shows on there, so please do go and subscribe to that. Finally then, Johnston, just a final word on the legendary Barney Ross.
When I first heard of Barney, it was a story that stuck with me through years. Just when you sort of look at someone, you have a brief look, didn't you? And it's just the story that surrounded him from the very beginning to the end. And it wasn't just the ring. And we love all this, Sean. We do. We love all the internets. And there's nothing better than going back to, like, those depression years, the 1930s, the 1940s, and the mafia influence. We love that as well. So incorporating that and then all the other stuff that came with it is a no-brainer. Barney Ross had to be done. Crazy thing is, we haven't done Benny Leonard. Benny Leonard's probably the best Jewish boxer that's ever lived. So it's good to keep those ones to the side. Henry Armstrong's another one that was mentioned in Barney Ross, obviously ended Barney's career. Another great career profile that we could do, and Rocky Marciano. There's so many great ones, and it's nice to do these ones that not everyone knows about Barney. And I think I'm hoping we've done Barney Ross justice, and I hope that it makes people read a little bit more about him. Find out anything new, let us know. It'd be great.
Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure delivering this career profile on the legend that was Barney Ross.